Our sermon text today comes from Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 21. The Lord dealt with Sarah. Sorry, that was verse 1. Let me skip down to verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. And she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. May God add blessing to the reading and hearing of the Holy Word.
Welcome back to Holy Ground, our summer worship series inspired by our national parks. 2 weeks ago, we visited where day begins in the continental United States, Acadia National Park in Maine. Last week, we traveled over 2,500 miles to the west to visit Arches National Park in Utah. And today we head, as they might say where I'm from, to a whole nother country. Big Bend National Park in the great state of Texas. I was super tempted to have us sing, "The stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas," today, especially when I came across this quote in America's Holy Ground, our guide for this series. Big Bend National Park is tucked away in southwestern Texas, far from anything. It is so removed from cities that it was recognized in 2012 for having the darkest nighttime skies in the contiguous 48 states. As a native Texan, and not only a native Texan, but a fifth-generation Texan on both sides of my family, it pains me to admit that I have never been to Big Bend National Park. And that is my loss. Big Bend was established as a national park in 1944. Technically, it is desert, the Chihuahuan Desert to be exact, which also extends west toward El Paso and south into Mexico. Summer highs reach over 100 degrees and winter lows dip right around freezing. The entire area receives only 10 inches of rain per year or so. But desert is not all there is to Big Bend. The Chisos Mountains extend 20 miles through the park from the southwest to the northeast. It is the only mountain range totally contained within a single national park. Some of the highest peaks in the Chisos Mountains rise well above 7,000 feet. And then, of course, there is the river. The Rio Grande forms Big Bend's southern and eastern boundaries, cutting canyons 1,500 feet deep in some places as it flows through the park. All these different microclimates mean that Big Bend is home to lots of wildlife, a wide variety of wildlife. In fact, there are more species of birds, bats, butterflies, ants, scorpions, and cacti in Big Bend than any other national park in the United States. Not that having more species of scorpions is anything to brag about, but you know, Texans, we will brag about anything. You can find black bears and mountain lions in Big Bend, along with a variety of tree species, including ponderosa pine, fir, cypress, oak, and aspen. So think a minute about those last three types of trees and where they usually grow. Cypress trees grow in the bayou. Oak trees grow around here. Aspens in Colorado. Where else can you find swamp, plains, and mountains all within the same 801,163 acres? Only in a place as diverse as Big Bend National Park. Big Bend gets its name from a 90-degree turn in the course of the Rio Grande. From its headwaters in south-central Colorado, the Rio Grande flows south for over 1,800 miles toward the Gulf of Mexico, except for the Big Bend, where the river takes a surprising turn to the north. I will try to draw it for you with my finger. I have practiced this all week. So here's the top of Texas, and then it goes down like this, and it goes over toward El Paso. And then you have the river border here, and then all of a sudden it takes this dip to the north, and then back down for the rest of Texas. That is where Big Bend National Park is. Now, since you're accustomed to rivers around here, personally, I think the Illinois River is magnificent. I should probably tell you that the Rio Grande might be a little disappointing the first time you see it, especially if you are there in the dry season. As one traveler put it, I followed Jeanette, the park ranger, toward the water. As we emerged from the trees, the river finally came into view. I stopped, stunned. Instead of the mighty raging rapids I had anticipated, I was faced with a slow-moving, shallow, brown creek. Jeanette looked over and smiled. Smaller than you were expecting? I guess I thought the Rio Grande would be a little bit more grande, I said, trying not to sound too disappointed. But just because the Rio Grande is at times not so grande, that doesn't mean it's not important. It forms, as you likely know, the border between the U.S. and Mexico in the state of Texas. As Brad Lyons and Bruce Barkhauer write in America's Holy Ground, international law has established the middle of the Rio Grande Channel as the border. Spend any time on a river at all, and you'll know your boat will likely veer back and forth across the channel with the currents. Flowing downstream at Big Bend, with the United States on your left and Mexico on your right, you probably won't know how many times you leave and re-enter the United States on a single float. The border lines there are quite literally fluid. Lyons and Barkhauer go on. Borders can be very real, like the tranquil Rio Grande flowing to the ocean that divide the U.S. and Mexico. Or, get ready for it, they're about to hit us right between the eyeballs. Borders can be altogether imaginary, they say, like those separating people from each other. It seems to me that we are experts at creating these imaginary borders between each other, borders that separate us, one from the other. We are really good at creating dividing lines between us and them. We are masters at asserting our power over others, in effect declaring, I have worth and you do not. It is temptingly, sinfully easy for us to disregard each other's humanity. This is the dark side of the human condition, and we have been at it since the beginning. Our story today from Genesis is one of the most difficult in the Bible, I think. So difficult that I have never preached on it before. I have been preaching for 30 years. I have been preaching weekly for 20, and I have never preached on this passage before. I have avoided it like the plague. So get ready. This is going to be a hard one. Genesis 21 tells a story about imaginary borders, us and them, power plays, dividing lines that say, I have worth and you do not. It is a story about the dark side of the human condition. And to tell you the truth, it makes me not like Sarah, which is so strange for me because I grew up loving Sarah. I soaked up all the stories I heard about her like a sponge. But I don't want to soak up Sarah in this story. It is a terrible story. It is ghastly. Sarah creates an imaginary border between herself and Hagar that says, in effect, I am worthy and you are not. Sarah's behavior toward Hagar is, in my opinion, downright sinful. I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, what about Abraham, Jenny? His behavior is just as ghastly and just as sinful. And yes, you are right. Abraham's actions are just as bad. I am not letting him off the hook here, but I want to try to express to you how betrayed I felt by Sarah when I first learned this story, and how hard it was for me to reconcile the Sarah that I had in my head with the Sarah I finally met on the page. Growing up, I had internalized Sarah as a model to follow. And then I learned this story. Let's rewind a bit. Abraham and Sarah are happily living their lives in their ancestral home of Haran when God calls them to go. So they go. They go out into the wilderness to the west, and they keep going until God tells them to stop. In between, they flee down to Egypt to escape famine in the land, which is evidently where they acquire a slave girl named Hagar. How young was she when they took her from her home? They didn't teach us to ask this question in Wichita Falls. Fast forward with me now several years. Abraham and Sarah are back living in the land that God had promised them, but still they have no children. God had promised that too. You shall have as many descendants as the stars in the sky, God had told Abraham back in Genesis 15, but still there is no baby. Sarah becomes desperate, and in her desperation, she does something dreadful. Here, Abraham, take my slave girl. Any child she has will be mine. Let us pause for a minute and think about what's going on here. How wrong this is on every single level. We didn't think about that in Wichita Falls either. But as bad as that part of the story is, it only gets worse. Hagar does conceive a child, and as one might expect, this leads to conflict in the household. Genesis 16 tells us that Hagar looked with contempt upon her mistress. And I mean, seriously, what did Sarah expect? You could see this conflict coming a mile away. Abraham, this slave girl looked at me with contempt, she complains one day. Note that Sarah won't even use Hagar's name. She is slave girl. She obviously knows her name because we wouldn't know it otherwise. But Sarah won't use it. She has to preserve this border that she has created between them. I deserve an A. This slave girl does not. This simple act of not using her name dehumanizes Hagar. And that is just the beginning. She's your slave girl, Abraham replies. Do with her as you please. And with this, Abraham has also dehumanized Hagar and sanctioned domestic violence to boot. Genesis 16, verse 6 tells us that Sarah did deal with her harshly. We can imagine what this means. I told you this was a hard, hard story. And still there is more. Still it is not over. Still it gets worse. In due time, Hagar bears a son, Ishmael. And also in due time, Sarah bears a son, Isaac. The two boys grow up together. One day, Sarah sees Ishmael playing with Isaac, and she is immediately jealous. I cannot stand the thought of this slave woman's boy, still no name for either of them, Hagar or Ishmael. I cannot stand the thought of this slave woman's boy playing with my son, having all the benefits that my boy has. Then she demands to Abraham, Abraham, cast her out. I will not have them in my household. Genesis chapter 21, verse 11 says, the matter was very distressing to Abraham. You think? So while I am beating my head against the wall with Abraham's behavior, I also want to point out that Abraham's initial reaction to this request is the right one. Initially, he is horrified by this thought. But sin has a way of entering into the human heart. Those borders, those false divisions we place between ourselves and another have a way of showing up. And Abraham here makes the wrong choice. Very early in the morning, Abraham leads Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert, where he gives them a loaf of bread and a skin of water. Then he turns his back on them and abandons them to the elements. Note that he doesn't say a word to either of them. There's not a goodbye. There's not an I'm sorry. There's not I'll pray for the best. There's not Godspeed. There's nothing. Abraham doesn't say a word because there is nothing to say. He knows that what he is doing is wrong, and yet he still does it. This is a silent, heartbreaking scene. I want you to picture it. I want you to feel it. From Hagar's perspective, I want you to feel her panic and her fear and her desperation. She has just been abandoned in the desert. I really struggle with this story because Abraham and Sarah are lifted up all the time as heroes of our faith. And yet, here they have sent a mother and her boy, a mother and Abraham's own boy out to die. What are we supposed to do with that? When there is no more water, Hagar leaves Ishmael under a bush because she just cannot bear to watch him die. She cannot bear to hear his cries of thirst and anguish and know that she can do nothing to save him. So she moves a little distance away, and the text tells us that she begins to weep. Her cries rise up to heaven, and here, right here, is where we learn what we are supposed to do with that. Because here, right here, is where we learn that we don't have to create all these imaginary borders between each other, separating us one from another. We don't have to mark out dividing lines between us and them. We don't have to assert our power over another, in effect declaring, I have worth and you do not. We don't have to give in to the temptation, the sin of disregarding each other's humanity. It is a choice. It is a choice. We can choose the path of Abraham and Sarah, the path of this awful, sickening story that leads to brokenness and the brink of death. We can choose that, or we can choose the path of life modeled here by God himself, because here, right here, we see God's more excellent way. Genesis 21, verses 17 through 19. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called out to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the cries of this boy. Come, lift him up and hold him fast, for I will make a great nation of him." And then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. This is what we are supposed to do. We who have been created in God's image. Whereas Abraham and Sarah turned their backs on Hagar and Ishmael, God hears their cries. This is the path of life. Whereas Abraham and Sarah won't even call Hagar and Ishmael by name, God uses their names. God sees them and acknowledges them and knows them. This is the path of life. Whereas Abraham and Sarah cruelly abandoned Hagar and Ishmael and cast them out to die, God has compassion for them and intervenes to help. This is the path of life. Whereas Abraham and Sarah leave Hagar and Ishmael with next to nothing, God provides for them and blesses them. This is the path of life. What are we supposed to do? It is a choice. We can choose death or we can choose life. The National Park Service website refers to Big Bend National Park as Texas' gift to the nation, which is pretty classic because that's pretty much how Texans think of ourselves, as the gift to the nation. But in this case, that nickname might not actually be a mark of Texas bravado. There's actually some truth to it, especially if you know the history behind the formation of Big Bend National Park. In his book, Leave Only Footprints, author Connor Knighton reports that in 1935, Texas Senator Morris Shepherd wrote to President Franklin Roosevelt suggesting that Big Bend be established as an international park. An international park. The vision was for Big Bend to be to use his words, peace park, jointly managed by the United States and Mexico. An international peace park. A little pie in the sky, perhaps, but wow, what a vision. I mentioned that Big Bend became a national park in 1944. What I did not mention was that it became a national park on June 12th, 1944, a mere 6 days after the Allied invasion at Normandy, what we call D-Day. So think about that. While the world was being torn apart, consumed by history's most grotesque example of callous disregard for each other's humanity, an ocean away, this beautiful land was being set aside as a testimony to peace. A testimony that there is a more excellent way. A testimony that we have a choice. A testimony to life. Such a witness is indeed a gift to the nation. Let us join together in singing.